What's going on, Sirens fans? Welcome back to another expansion edition of Siren Sounds. Lou Orlando, New York Sirens beat reporter. We had talked in the week leading in to brace for expansion and specifically to brace for Phase 2, because that was when a lot of the chaos was going to unfold, the player turnover, and that was certainly the case, right? Phase 2's in the books. Phase 3 already underway as I record this on a Wednesday evening, and we'll get this up Thursday morning. And even now, right, some expansions coming through, or some signings coming through today, Wednesday, for Phase 3. But, Phase 2 was where the bulk of the major damage so far was done. I think that was to be expected. All of the existing teams, minus Vancouver, have lost at least one piece from their 2025-26 roster. For most teams, it's multiple key pieces. For some, it's stars that are moving from one team to another. But we're here to talk about the Sirens, and that's what we'll key in on here. Easiest way to do this is chronologically. We'll keep it quick. We'll dive in. We'll start with Phase 2. We'll work our way forward. To round things up from Phase 2, the Sirens lose 4 players. It's Kayle Osborne, Kristin O'Neill, and Cherkowski, Maddi Wheeler. I don't know that any were entirely unexpected. We certainly talked at length about Kayle Osborne, and once she was unprotected in Phase 1, really had the feeling that she was going to be gone. And wrote about Wheeler and Cherkowski coming in, that those were 2 realistic targets for expansion teams, that they might be looking for rookie forwards to build around, and that certainly was the case. And then, Kristin O'Neill, I don't think that we explicitly covered her, but the consensus was, hey, this is the top unrestricted free agent on New York's roster. And so not entirely surprising to see her get signed as well in this phase. Osborne's the first to go, and I think that does reflect that she was the most valuable piece on the board, unprotected, for the Sirens. And so she's one of the first players to get locked up when expansion, or when Phase 2 opens on Friday. First goalie off the board. Signs a 3-year deal with PWHL Hamilton. She's an Ontario native, so that's about a little less than 4 hours away from her hometown in Westport, Ontario. We'd kind of drawing that connection a little bit, just speculating about, if she's going to go anywhere, is she going to want to go back home, ends up linking up with Chris Spar. I think that's a good situation for her. We talk more about that later. Saturday, the Cherkowski news breaks in the morning. O'Neill happens that afternoon. O'Neill on a EFO, which is a binding contract. And then Wheeler breaks really at the buzzer Monday, and that comes out in the evening, but everything finalized before the 3 p.m. cutoff line. There was a bit there where it looked like there was going to be a selection process. And I think that would have been bad news for the Sirens when you look at how many players they had under contract, and the selection process is only players that are under contract or rights held. So Cherkowski was under contract, Wheeler had her rights held. And you go down the list of New York's roster, there's a lot of players that didn't get taken that are either under contract or RFAs that would have been on the board if a selection process got triggered. So I think it's good news that didn't happen. But obviously that Wheeler news is kind of the last signing that we get on Monday. And that one certainly stings a little bit. But if you're looking to assess Phase 2 and the impact, what it means for New York, I think the slogan that I would slap on it is not great, could be worse. I think that's the feeling that most Sirens fans have to have. You certainly don't feel good. You don't feel great. You lost 4 players. That was tied for the most across the league with Seattle. You lost 3 players under contract. That was the max allowed for any existing teams in Phase 2. So you certainly it felt like pushed to the limit a little bit there in terms of what you could lose. There's certainly straight up from a quantity perspective. And I mean, all 4 of those players, and we'll dive into it more, but all 4 of them were certainly impact players last season. That it really does hurt to lose when you're trying to build this team up into a contender for next season and beyond. But I think if you once the emotions kind of pass, and obviously there's some fan favorites in the mix here that end up going elsewhere, once you have some time to sit on it and maybe some of the emotions pass, I think it'll be hard to shake the feeling that this was not the worst case scenario. There were far worse outcomes that I think could have played out here in Phase 2. I tweeted about this a little bit Monday night. That defensive core that New York has, completely unscathed in Phase 2. And the big one there is Maja Nylen Persson. That's a huge win that she makes it to Phase 3. I'll speak candidly. It's not coming from anywhere, but she was not someone I expected to still be on the table here for New York as we're talking about Phase 3 protections. I looked at her, frankly, as I thought she was the number 2 target on the board here behind Osborne. Clearly, Osborne was the top target. Megan Dugan, who's the GM of PWHL Hamilton, was thrilled that she was left unprotected. I think the consensus here was that if it wasn't Hamilton, it was going to be someone else. There was basically no way that Kayle Osborne was making it to Phase 3 unsigned. But to me, then I looked at this roster, and no knock against O'Neill or Cherkowski or Wheeler, who I'm not surprised that they drew interest. But I looked at Nylen Persson as a 25-year-old defender who has a great two-way game, plays quarterback, quarterbacks the power play, really shifty, deceptive offensive player that I think still has room to grow and develop. And you're talking about a pretty manageable contract at $54,000. And to me, that screamed like, hey, this is a defender that you can build around. So the fact that she is still on the board here for New York in Phase 3, that's a huge win. And I mean, obviously, there are other key players on that defensive core, too. And we've got a whole segment where we're going to go in and talk about who's on the board for New York right now in terms of protection slots and who's going to factor into this decision. But, I mean, your captain, Micah Zandee-Hart, your alternate captain, Jamie Bourbonnais, Allison Simpson is someone that we're going to have to talk about today. The fact that you have all 4 of them, that they're still in your control for the time being, that's a big win. And so I think that maybe colors how we feel or how fans probably should feel about Phase 2. Not to say that, that it doesn't sting. I think, funnily enough, the Wheeler move or the Wheeler signing was probably the biggest gut punch. And why I think that's funny is if you were to rank the 4 players that New York lost, whether that's on-ice impact last season or long-term value, I think in both cases, maybe Wheeler's 4th on that list of the 4. We could have some back and forth about whether that's short-selling her a little bit, but Maddi Wheeler is not a starting goalie that started 27 to 30 games. She's not Kristin O'Neill, who's one of the best defensive forwards in the PWHL and someone that New York really leaned on last season. And she's not as highly touted a prospect as Cherkowski. If we're speaking frankly, Cherkowski has the higher offensive ceiling. I think probably the more attractive PWHL prospect. I think Wheeler probably by default, a lot of people would have her 4th on that list. But because of the timing of everything, because of the way that Monday unfolded, I think it's her coming off the board and her going to San Jose that really hurts the most. And now it's not completely this unappetizing bag or this awful blow. Like it comes with the fact that when she signs, you know that Nylen Persson is safe. And so I think that was somewhat of a consolation when that news drops. But you're going through the day Monday, and you're bracing for a selection process. And again, I'll say it again. I thought the selection process would be bad news for New York. Like, sure, there are other talented players on the board, but if we were going to do a selection process and there are going to be 4 or 5 slots to fill, I had a hard time thinking that at least one of those was going to be a Siren. Now, I think technically the Sirens could only lose one player because by that point, Osborne and Cherkowski had already signed. So, hey, maybe it was a toss-up between, is it Nylen Persson or is it Wheeler? If we're doing a selection process, I think the first one off the board is Nylen Persson. So, again, maybe that's the consolation there. But as that day unfolds, and again, you come in with 5 slots, or 5 players that expansion teams need to sign, and by midpoint through the day, we find out that Vegas has all their signings locked up. They did it without a selection process. And now it's one last spot on San Jose to fill. So you're one signing from any other team away from getting out of Phase 2, and the damage is Osborne, O'Neill, Cherkowski, which is damage, but you skip to the bank, I think, if that's all of the damage is. And then the In-Canada report comes out. He's hearing it's going to be a Siren. And again, probably bracing for, I know I certainly was bracing for Nylen Persson at that point in time, but then it comes out that it's Wheeler. And I just think the timing of that, maybe you started to get your hopes up that New York was going to escape with only 3 players getting plucked from their roster, that 4th comes in at the buzzer. I think it really hurts. I think you feel that maybe emotionally. But again, at the end of the day, this could have gone worse. There's certainly some big hits here. Osborne's the biggest loss, but I think somewhat easier to stomach just because it kind of felt like a fait accompli that she was gone. Right, the truth of the matter is that as soon as New York didn't include her on their protection list from Phase 1, that she was as good as gone. And clearly that is the biggest spot and the most glaring spot that I think New York has to fill this offseason. Is you got to be able to find a starting goalie. And we'll talk a little bit today about maybe they have some more options on the table than I anticipated, at least here in Phase 3. But certainly some significant holes now in your forward group, and whether you want to call it top 6, middle 6. Kristin O'Neill was the second-line center all season long. And Cherkowski played in the top 6 for most of the season. Top line forward for a pretty good chunk of the season. And Maddi Wheeler kind of bounces back and forth between the second and third line. I don't think it would be mischaracterizing it to call her a top 6 forward. She certainly played a pretty big role in that forward group. So 3 sizable holes left in that forward group, and I think 3 important roles to fill, right? Kristin O'Neill is, I'd say, about as good of a defensive forward as you're going to find in the PWHL. There's a reason that she's on Canada's Olympic team, and it's not necessarily because of her offensive prowess. Now, I think there's more to her offensive game than maybe she's shown in the PWHL. We've seen that on the international level, that she gets on Team Canada, she plays under Troy Ryan. Maybe it's simply that Team Canada is stacked and she's playing with the best athletes in the world. But she gets to Team Canada, and we see that offensive touch a little bit more. But even without that offensive flair, and she ends the 2025-26 season with 5 points and 4 goals, she brings so much on the defensive end. Really fast, hard-nosed back checker. You're never going to see her give up on a play. And super reliable in terms of, hey, you can throw her out there at any situation, the opponent's top line, and you feel really good about who you have down the middle. And that's not even talking about what she does in the faceoff dot. And she's been one of the league's best faceoff specialists since it started in 2024. It finished 9th in the league in faceoff win percentage this season. You're talking about someone that's a really well-rounded asset that won't be easy to replace. That's a big 2C role that New York has to fill. I think maybe fueling, we're not going to get into this a ton, we'll have a little more time to talk about it next week, but maybe fueling the need for New York to go out there and in the first round try and get a forward and maybe a center. So that's certainly, that O'Neill loss, she wore a lot of hats for New York, and Fargo really leaned on her. And Cherkowski, it felt like she didn't reach her ceiling in 2025-26, but generated a ton of chances. And there's a reason that they kept her in the top 6 for most of the season. And part of that is that, what other options did you really have? Like, she was still one of your top options even as the puck luck wasn't there. But I think she finishes 3rd on the team in shots. And that maybe that doesn't tell the entire story, but the eye test showed a player that was explosive and had a real sense for the net and could really generate a lot of offense and be a big-time facilitator, no doubt, but also get her own offense and find a way to break out and get some shots on breakaways and stuff like that and create her own shots. So they talked about her coming into the season as they thought she was a first-round talent. They drafted her 9th overall, so that was the first pick of the second round. I think they meant it when they talked about her as a first-round talent. I'm not sure that we saw that first-round talent necessarily come to fruition last season, but she's going to be a prime breakout candidate next season, so that certainly stings. And then with Wheeler, Wheeler's offensive upside, I don't think, is at the same level as Cherkowski or Casey O'Brien, Garcina Kaltenkova, or, some of the other rookies that she came in with. But the reason that the Wheeler signing stings, maybe beyond just, hey, the timing of it, is that, she felt like a picture-perfect fit for New York's system. Talk about the things that New York wanted to do last season, the type of team that they wanted to be. And the words that you kept hearing were fast, tough, gritty. That's Maddi Wheeler. She was a super dependable 200-foot player, really comfortable laying the body around, hard-nosed player, drove to the net. That's someone that I think is going to get at least 10 points a season simply by driving to the net and cleaning up the dirty laundry in there, cleaning up the loose change. I think her offensive talents can probably develop as well, and then I think then you're talking about a really dangerous top sixer. But for even what she was as a rookie, to get that type of play out of a mid-4th rounder, the 27th overall pick, one of the steals of the draft, hands down. And again, just such a perfect fit for New York's current system under Greg Fargo and Pascal Daoust that I think, maybe New York started to dream about having Wheeler for years and years. And that's a dream that's not going to come true. So certainly, right, this is a painful phase 2. There's no way around that. But it's not the worst case scenario. And, there's still a path here for New York to really have a solid offseason and go into the 2026-27 season in a really solid spot to contend with the rest of the league. One little note here about the 4 players that departed that has been reported and confirmed and kind of matches up with everything that we heard from exit day is that all 4 players that left wanted to be here next season. And when I say wanted to be here, they wanted to be in New York next season. And, I don't think that should come as really as a surprise to anyone. Kayle Osborne, obviously, a little saddened not to be included on the protection list. She said she understood it. There's a really good article by Chris Donkin that she was able to catch up with Kayle and kind of talk to her about it. Certainly excited to get the opportunity to go back closer to home and play for Hamilton and play for a very good coach in Chris Spar. And when we talked at media availability on Tuesday, that was certainly her sentiment was, it stings a little bit. I had a lot of good memories with Greg Fargo and the Sirens. And her relationship with Greg Fargo goes back to 2020. She's played under him for the last 6 seasons. But there was a lot of excitement about joining a new team and a new coach and a new GM. But, all 4 of these players were interested in staying in New York. O'Neill, being an unrestricted free agent, was the only one that got a deal that literally couldn't turn down. The EFO is a binding contract where team offers you that contract, you have to play for them. Now, we've seen the Hillary Knight stuff, and there's a way to maneuver out of that and maybe land in a destination that you want to. By all accounts, Kristin O'Neill is very happy and fine being in San Jose. Great rapport with Troy Ryan, who's the coach and GM there, spoke very highly about him, spoke highly about the vision for the team so far. So, don't get it twisted. I think there was a report out there that Kristin O'Neill wasn't interested in going to San Jose. While I do think that New York was her top choice and that if it was up to her that she would have stayed in New York. I don't think by any means that she's unhappy to be in San Jose and be with a coach that in the past has been able to get the most out of her. As for everyone else, well, Osborne, Cherkowski, and Wheeler were all on their original rookie contracts. And while they did have a say in where they ended up, when you're talking about players making, in Osborne and Wheeler's case, close to the league minimum, or even Cherkowski, who made over $50,000 last season, but it's going to be hard to pass up either a raise or a new opportunity. And all the expansion teams had to do for anyone that was either under contract or an expiring RFA is match their contract, exceed it, or in the case of someone like Maddi Wheeler, to have to offer them a contract that meets what would have been the one-year qualifying RFA. They don't end up doing that. They just come to a standard 2-year deal with Maddi Wheeler. I think you see that the rookies, and especially the players that are on close to league minimum deals, that they're going to be a lot of the players that, if they're unprotected, probably move in expansion this year, simply because of the prospect of either getting a pay raise or perhaps even the prospect of a widely expanded role. There's a chance that Cherkowski is going to be stapled onto the top line. Maddi Wheeler is going to have a great opportunity to get top 6 minutes game in and game out. We don't know what San Jose is going to do with their signings and building out the rest of their roster. But, it's safe to assume if you're one of the 5 foundational players of a team, that you're going to be in a huge role. And if that comes with payroll, I think it's easy to see why that might be something that's hard to pass up. So I would confirm that all 4 players, everything that I heard, wanted to be in New York. But I think you understand, in the case of all 4 of them, why they end up where they end up. The rest of this episode, we're going to be talking about Phase 3. I think New York has a lot of different routes here in terms of what they can do with the 3 protection slots. Just to give you guys a little bit of an overview of what this is going to look like. They're calling this the preliminary open signing period. Basically, what's on the table here are players on expiring deals. That means strictly UFAs. So expiring or expansion teams can sign up to 3 UFAs if they want during this 3-day period. They don't have to. By the end of Phase 4, they have to be at 10 players signed, each of them. So they can sign up to 3 here. They don't have to sign any. And then the existing teams, they're submitting a 3-player protection list by Friday. But the other wrinkle here is that they too can sign any UFA, whether it's someone that was on their roster last season or whether it's simply a UFA that hasn't signed a deal yet with their existing team or an expansion team. The one, wrinkle or condition there is that if you sign that UFA, they're locked in as one of your 3 protection slots. So it really is kind of a redo of Phase 1, but the expansion teams are going to be more active, and so I think there's going to be a time element to this of if you want to protect a UFA, you kind of got to get to them before someone else does. It really does. They call it an open signing period for a reason. It's a little bit like free agency in that sense of, just because someone was on your roster, if they're unrestricted, they're up for grabs. And it's kind of their decision about what their timeline is of when they're going to sign. So that's the structure that we're working under. Clearly, it seems like the common sense move for New York this time around is to prioritize the defensive core. I think ultimately that's what's going to happen. You protected 3 forwards in Phase 1. I'm not sure that you expected to be in this spot in Phase 3 with the entirety of your defensive core still intact. But even if you didn't, that is a gift that's fallen onto your lap. And I think New York has to make the most of it, right? You're trying to build a well-rounded team here. And looking at New York's roster, the best remaining talent lies in that defensive core. So I think it behooves the Sirens to go out there and protect them. Nylen Persson's a layup here. I wrote about this in an article that I posted this afternoon. again, you kind of didn't expect that Nylen Persson that you'd be in this situation where she's still on the board. She's such a talented player. For my money, she was, I think, their best defender in 2025-26. That I don't want to say that you lucked out, but you came out of phase 2 and you were able to skirt by without Nylen Persson signing with an expansion team. You do not want to give them another chance to either correct that mistake or just give them another crack at Nylen Persson. Like, you got to lock her up. And I think all signs to point to that being the case. We look back to last season and New York's, what ends up being 4 protection slots. And there was obviously some controversy and some drama surrounding what New York decides to do last summer. Nylen Persson was their 4th protected player. Over some notable names. Jessie Eldridge was on the board. She ends up signing with Seattle. Jamie Bourbonnais was on the board. She ends up going unselected in expansion, but that was a key piece of the defensive core. Abby Rock gets left unprotected. Obviously ends up getting traded, but that's a big. Clearly, we saw for in the Walter Cup playoffs how much of an impact player that she is. That the fact that Nylen Persson gets protected over some of the other names that Pascal Daou could have protected last summer, I think gives you a little bit of a window into what they think about her. And from everything that I've been told and from everything that I've witnessed, I don't get the sense that their standing on her has changed in any way. And so I fully expect her to be one of their 3 protections. Again, this is in a league like this and in an expansion process like this where there are a lot of really difficult decisions. I think this is as easy and straightforward as it gets. You write Nylen Persson's name down as one of those 3 protected players, and you don't think twice about it. And I don't even think we need to go really too much deeper into this. But, I said in the article, I fully believe she was their best defender last season. She leads the team in ice time. I thought that was deservingly so. I don't think that you have another player that really matches her skill set. And if you lose her, boy, is it going to be hard to find someone that can do what she does on the ice. A power play quarterback like that. Listen, New York's power play certainly had its struggles last season. Do I think it could benefit from a stronger power play quarterback? I do. I wouldn't say that Nylen Persson is one of the premier power play quarterbacks in the league. I think there are better players that move the puck at the point. But of the players that New York has available, I think she's certainly their best option. And I don't know that you're going to be able to find an upgrade in the open market this season. Maybe in the draft, if you get Layla Edwards, is she your power play quarterback and she's running power play 1 next season? I think that's it's a plausible outcome. We'll get to that when we get to that. But again, one of the themes we're going to talk about here is you really can't bank on getting one particular player in the draft. And so you got to lock up Nylen Persson. You don't think twice about it. The other 3, those being Zandee-Hart, Bourbonnais, and Simpson, I think have to work their way into this conversation as well. What I'll say here is that I don't see any world, or I have a hard time. I won't go that far because that makes it. Trying not to speak in absolutes here. I have a hard time seeing a world where New York doesn't protect at least 2 defenders here. Do they go for a full 3? That I'm not necessarily sure about. I think there's certainly, with those names, you could understand if the 3 protected are Nylen Persson, Zandee-Hart, and Bourbonnais, or Nylen Persson, Zandee-Hart, and Simpson. I don't think people are going to be necessarily up in arms about that. That's certainly a realistic path that Pascal Daou and this organization can go down. I think you're at least getting 2 of the 3 are going to be defenders here. Zandee-Hart's really interesting. Zandee-Hart and Bourbonnais really as 2 players I look at that I think have a lot of immunity in expansion. I continue not to be worried about them. You know, being under contract really gives you a lot of control in expansion, but particularly if you were under contract and you have a big salary, I think you really have a lot of agency to pick your path. And that's the difference between players like Zandee-Hart and Bourbonnais and someone like Kayle Osborne or Maddi Wheeler, where, you know, they are primed to get a pay raise, and New York not in the position to give them that because they're already under contract for a select portion of time. Or, I mean, New York could have given Wheeler a pay raise had she gotten the Phase 3 simply because of she was an expiring RFA. But Kayle Osborne, right, was already locked into her rookie contract for next season. So New York wasn't going to be able to change what her salary looked like, but an expansion team could. And so I think that's tempting for players like that. With Zandee-Hart and Bourbonnais, as we kind of said last episode, and we don't know what their exact salary figures are. And I know what they're right. It's always dangerous to assume. But these are two players that made $90,000 or more in 2025-26. They were two of New York's highest paid players on the roster. There we go. They signed 1-year extensions. We don't have those exact values yet. Those numbers are not going to drop off the table. You know, we're not going to get to next season and all of a sudden Micah Zandee-Hart is making $50,000. Like, I think it's safe to assume, I know it's dangerous, but I think it's fairly safe to assume they're still going to be two of New York's higher paid players going on to next season. And they've both been incredibly clear and incredibly emphatic that New York is the place they want to be. And if it's up to them, that they're not going to leave. Yeah. Zandee-Hart, we've heard the stories throughout the season and what Pascal Daoust said at media availability about how she's like an assistant GM. She's part of the process. She's the why and how of this process. We're making all these decisions with her in mind. And that doesn't sound like someone that's just going to all of a sudden uproot and move somewhere else to a different team just because maybe a more lucrative offer's on the table. I feel similarly about Bourbonnais, who has that great quote, I'm a New York Siren forever at exit day. But the other part of this now is that you're talking about expansion teams that made big splashes in Phase 2. And now they're going to have to stay, you know, it's not a salary cap, but it's an average salary, which is going to be about $60,099. So that's the average. You have to meet it, you know, within 10% on one side or the other. Well, I mean, you've got PWHL Detroit, who's spent really big. And I don't know that they can afford too many contracts that are upwards of $80,000 at this stage of the game. Vegas already has 4 defenders, so are they even in the market for another defender, let alone someone that is going to be kind of cost you a pretty penny here? Hamilton's kind of gone about their business, and they've got cheaper contracts. Report is that Brianne Jenner took a pay cut to get to PWHL Hamilton. And at San Jose, I think similarly, if memory serves, they haven't spent extravagantly yet, which is why obviously there's no, you know, there's always risk involved when you leave someone unprotected. But with teams kind of starting to need to balance their salaries a little bit more, two players like that at least last season made $90,000 or more, I think become two players that I don't know that expansion teams can really go after them as aggressively as maybe they might have in Phase 2 if that interest was there. And again, you also have to come back to they're really not going to move unless they want to. You know, the one exception is if the selection process gets triggered. But even then, you know, if a selection process gets triggered, are Zandee-Hart and Bourbonnais going to be the names that go? I have a hard time seeing that. But with all that on the table, does New York want to entertain the risk of losing Zandee-Hart specifically? You know, I think there's a world where they leave Bourbonnais unprotected with all that we have in mind, all that we just put out there about her contract and why she has agency and the expansion contracts in general, how the expansion teams are stacking up. But I think she's got a pretty good shot to stay with New York, even if she does get left unprotected. I think there's a decent shot that New York does leave her unprotected. with Zandee-Hart, because of the way that they've talked about her and how much that they've invested in her, and she was one of their first 3 protections last season, with even bigger names on the board than there were when they protected Nylen Persson. They left Alex Carpenter and Corinne Schroeder unprotected so that they could protect Zandee-Hart. And if that doesn't tell you what they think about her, I don't know what does. So are they going to risk even the slightest chance that someone, if they manage their books well, has the room to take Zandee-Hart and decides, hey, it's a selection process, I'm going to nab her? I have a hard time thinking that New York is going to leave that possibility or that chance open. Again, they've invested so much in her. She's been such a big part of the decision-making process, really the last 2 off seasons now, if you factor in this one and the one before, that I really could see Pascal Dou saying, I don't know that Zandee-Hart's necessarily going to attract too much attention in expansion at this stage of the game, but we're not taking any chances, and we'll protect her. If she does get left unprotected, I think that reflects that he feels really strongly that she's not in any danger of being taken at this point. But I really could see Zandee-Hart being on this list. I think of the 3 not named Nylen Persson, because I've got Nylen Persson as that's a lock to be protected. Of Zandee-Hart, Bourbonnais, and Simpson, I think Zandee-Hart is the most likely to be the next name on that list. But in terms of the 3 about who's at most risk of moving, I think it's Simpson, who's younger than Zandee-Hart and Bourbonnais, a former 16th overall pick, the contract at least last season. Not that it was cheap, upwards of $70,000, but cheaper than Zandee-Hart and Bourbonnais. But still a, proven top 4 player. I think if there's anyone from that group that would draw interest and maybe you need to protect because otherwise she could sign elsewhere, I think it's Simpson. I think that's the one that you really have to ponder about, are we willing to lose her? How much do we feel like we really need her? Because she played a fairly big role last season, was able to plan her offhand a lot. Bourbonnais and Simpson ends up being the second pairing in that decor. And they both eat a lot of minutes. I don't think New York wants to lose any of them, any of those 4. I think, if you're talking about who's most likely to draw interest from expansion teams, of that group, I think it's Simpson. And so I wonder how much that colors the protection decision here. Because I do think if she gets left unprotected, not that it's a lock that she'll go anywhere else, but I think her odds would be most likely of going to a different destination if she's left unprotected here. So if it's up to me here, and you're going the protect 3 defenders route, I think I do Nylen Persson, Zandee-Hart, Simpson, and I leave Bourbonnais unprotected, and I'll take my chances in that open expansion market with her. I've seen some people, and even a couple people responded, well, Bourbonnais and Hamilton, it's closer to home. Do you think that's realistic? And this isn't coming from anywhere, just speculating, but I wonder if there are a lot of parallels to the Zandee-Hart situation last season. I think there are probably a lot of people that speculated about Micah and went from Vancouver, or more specifically from that province, a chance to play close to home that felt like a match made in heaven. And talking to Micah at the beginning of the season, she said that she thought about it. She's like, how could you not? She's like, I really haven't played in front of my family a ton. Like, when you get that type of proposition, go play home in Vancouver. I mean, how could you not consider it? Ultimately, she decides to stay in New York, that's what she wanted for her career. I wonder if there are any parallels there with Bourbonnais, where, I think if you asked Bourbonnais honestly, hey, do you want to play in Hamilton? I think she'd probably think about it, and, obviously, a 30-minute or so drive from where she grew up, and you're looking for a sweetener. Well, her partner Emily Clark signed in Hamilton. I'm sure that could be somewhat of a draw, but I haven't seen anything yet that leads me to believe that Jamie Bourbonnais is all of a sudden just going to uproot and vacate the Sirens after talking emphatically about how much she wanted to be here, and if it's up to her, she's not going anywhere. I think that would be a very sudden shift, even if she wasn't anticipating certain pieces to move that way in PWHL Hamilton. Yeah, I think Hamilton's an incredibly attractive destination if you're a defender, or if you're any player in the PWHL, but especially if you're a defender, the chance to play under Chris Spar, you watch what his defensive system did last season in Boston. I think Kayle Osborne's going to have a great time there, and I think any defender that goes there probably going to have a great time. You wonder if it's sometimes in the NHL we talk about the Carolina Hurricanes effect. I've got this on my mind because I'm thinking about K'Andre Miller a lot lately, and it feels like how much better he's gotten since he left the Rangers. I'm not going down a hole. I don't want to get down a whole rabbit hole about this, but it feels like Chris Spar could kind of be that guy in the PWHL. You chalk it up as he can turn any team into this elite defensive system. So I certainly get the appeal playing for PWHL Hamilton, and I think again, like Zandee-Hart, I bet Bourbonnais would tell you, boy, it's something I have to consider. But based on everything that she said, I truly believe that she means that she wants to stay in New York. And, I think, you can make a convincing argument that New York can't afford to lose Zandee-Hart for everything that she's meant to that locker room and how big of a part she's been in the decision-making process. Not to say that Bourbonnais isn't an important figure in that locker room. I think she's very well liked and very well respected, and obviously she's an alternate captain. So she's one of the biggest voices on that team, and New York doesn't want to lose her. But if you made New York pick, I think they take Zandee-Hart, and so I think they'd rather. My guess is they don't want to have the anxiety about potentially losing Zandee-Hart, even if they don't think that she's really up for grabs in expansion if they leave her unprotected. But I think if you're going the 3 defender route, you go Nylen Persson, Zandee-Hart, Simpson. I think that makes the most sense. But there are a couple other paths you could take. Do you consider protecting a forward? Yeah, I think you're foolish to at least not consider it. You look at the talent that they lost from that forward group, the 3 pieces that they lost, O'Neill, Cherkowski, and Wheeler. And it's not going to be easy to replace those spots in the top 6. We went into that in the first part of the show. How impactful all 3 of them were in their own way. All 3 of them kind of each playing a unique role in this team, but a very important role, respectively. That, I wonder, do you consider protecting someone like Paetyn Levis? Because as we're talking about, what's going to be of value to expansion teams, and we just did the whole argument in favor of Zandee-Hart and Bourbonnais, that their contracts might not be super appealing to an expansion team that's already spent money on 5 players and needs to stay under the cap. Well, the flip side of that is that any player that's of any type of bargain or any cheap deal becomes incredibly attractive, I think, in Phase 4. I wonder how much that ended up being part of it with Maddi Wheeler, is that she's a high upside forward on a league minimum deal, that it gives San Jose some more space to maneuver. Paetyn Levis is another one that kind of fits that mold of not a rookie, 3 years in the PWHL, and what have you seen from her? Well, she's a really solid defensive forward. And it's still one of New York's better secondary scorers. Reaches 10 points in 2025-26. Career high 5 goals. Her best offensive season to date in the pros. I think you're starting to see the flashes of the player that was the 2022 Frozen 4 MVP. Is she going to become an offensive superstar in this league? I'm not sure about that. But she's a really solid forward. And, the one thing that you have to remember here is that expanding 8 teams to 12, this is a huge expansion. There are players on teams that all of a sudden become exponentially more valuable. I think Maddi Wheeler is one that when you spread out the forward talent in this league, like all of a sudden she's I think a clear-cut top 6 forward. And I kind of feel that way with Paetyn Levis. That as this forward talent across the league kind of thins out, that she's going to have a top 6 role, maybe where, and maybe in a lot of places in the PWHL, and one of them being New York. So, and again, looking at what they've lost, well, Kristin O'Neill was, I'd say their top defensive forward. You've got another really solid forward defensively that's an unrestricted free agent in Denisa Krizova, and we'll get to her in just a second. Paetyn Levis is under contract through next season, 26 years old. Yeah, I think expansion teams are really going to like her. Now, is she going to be one of the first 40 players off the board now? Because that's where we'll get to by the end of Phase 4, is that every expansion team has to have 10 players. I mean, well, if Maddi Wheeler was one of the first 20 off the board, I think it shows you that this is not, we're not just going down the list of who led the league in points and going 1 through 20. That there's a little bit of strategy to this. There's a little bit of roster building. You need different role players. If you're looking for a role player with really good defensive instincts who plays a tenacious game, I think a lot of teams are going to want Paetyn Levis. I don't know how much Sirens fans are talking about her. I've seen a few kind of agree with me on this, that you could see a team go after Paetyn Levis. Has a lot of the qualities that a team might want in a middle sixer. So I think she's someone, if you left her unprotected, I think there's a fairly decent chance that she doesn't make it to Phase 5 or, even beyond, right? So is there a defender that you trade on that list of 3 that we just talked about to try and wiggle Paetyn Levis onto there? Do you risk Zandee-Hart because you feel like, okay, we don't really think that she's going to go in expansion? Or do you risk Simpson and just go, okay, we'd like to keep her. I feel like she might get some interest here, but we're already protecting 2 defenders, and we don't feel like that decor is going to get ravaged. Let's make sure we keep a good middle 6 forward like this. I could see that. The other part of this equation, and it does help New York, is that you can only lose 4 players under contract in expansion. That being 4 players who are under contract through next season. So New York has already lost 3. So they can only lose 1 more. It's a little bit of it's a numbers game and a game of chance. You're kind of gambling here of who can I leave available, and who's going to get taken more than the rest of my contracted players, that they're all safe. Now, New York is guaranteed that no matter what happens, if you include McKenna Webster, that they're going to come out of this ordeal with 13 players on their roster under contract that are going to be safe and with the team next season, barring any trades. That's not the end of the world. That actually puts New York in a pretty solid spot here. But who's going to be that last forward, or who's going to be that last player that gets taken? If it's Zandee-Hart, and again, probably not going to be, but in a world where Zandee-Hart gets taken, that's a huge blow. To a lesser extent, if Paetyn Levis gets taken, that's a pretty big blow to a forward group that's already suffered, I would say, some significant losses. There's 2 other forwards that I think we talk about, even though I don't think that they're really in this conversation in any meaningful way. But it's Krizova and it's Taylor Girard. The Krizova, I guess the argument is they traded for her. They traded Jinsey Rose for her at the deadline. Clearly they like her. I think she checked a lot of the boxes that they were looking for. Veteran forward on a team that was the youngest roster in the league last season. Championship pedigree. Clearly that's something that Pascal Daoust has really started to value. And certainly valued at the trade deadline in terms of playoff experience, going out and getting Krizova and Claire DeGeorge. And in terms of New York's system, it feels like a pretty seamless fit from the style of hockey that they like to play. The thing I found myself saying about her is, she really likes to go to the dirty areas of the ice. She's got no problem doing that. And pretty solid defensive game. Like, I think it makes sense for New York to want to keep her. I don't think she's going to be protected here in Phase 3. Could you see a team in Phase 4 go after her? I think certainly. She's really got a really solid rep in this league, it feels like. Minnesota clearly liked her because they went out of their way to trade her and get her back before the 2025-26 season. And yeah, they trade her again. You feel like Denisa Krizova is someone that GMs around the league like and value. Do they value her enough to make her one of the first 40 signings across the league in terms of expansion teams? That's the question. For what it's worth, I think New York has a decent chance. The re-signing period is Phase 5, and there's no limits for how many players that you can re-sign in that period. That I think she'll have a decent chance to get to that point. New York's clearly expressed interest in bringing her back. I think they will try to if she's still available to them in Phase 5. I feel similarly about Taylor Girard. I think if you were going to pick between the two, Krizova or Girard, who's more important to keep? Probably Taylor Girard. I say probably. I feel pretty confident about that. Losing Cherkowski and Wheeler and O'Neill, but Cherkowski and Wheeler were pretty big sources of offense if you're talking about secondary scorers. Colton Kova, Fillier, and O'Brien are in a tier of their own. They're the stars, and then after that, it's, all right, who's going to step up and be our secondary point producers? And it was Cherkowski, and it was Wheeler, and it was Paetyn Levis. It was Taylor Girard, who scored 7 goals in 17 games on an 18.9% shooting percentage. Now, that's a shooting percentage that's bound for some regression next season. And the bigger part of this, though, is the injury. She suffers a season-ending knee injury on March 15th. And I don't think they've technically said what it is, but we know it was season-ending. We know she got surgery. So, and it's in that knee area, right? So, well, if it's an ACL, it's a 9 to 12 month recovery process. And look at Dale Ross. And yeah, she was back on the ice by January after getting surgery in late March. So a similar timeline to Taylor Girard, to be honest with you. Now, Dale Ross played through it. Taylor Girard didn't. Every injury is different, and every ACL injuries are different. Taylor Girard went down right away. Dale Ross played through a torn ACL her entire senior college season. Kind of ridiculous. Amazing how the human body works. Clearly it took a toll on Dale Ross, and Greg Fargo talked about how difficult it is to gear up for a season when your off-season training is not hockey-related, it's just physically related, it's just health-related. That, I think there will certainly be some concern about what Taylor Girard is going to look like next season from an on-ice standpoint. And that's not to mention that it's her second season-ending knee injury in 3 seasons. She suffered a similar injury in the playoffs in 2024. So you're talking about a player that isn't particularly young. You're talking, this is prime window here of late 20s that has now suffered 2 season-ending injuries in her last 3 seasons, all in the same lower body area. Are expansion teams really going to be pursuing her in Phase 4 or Phase 3, knowing that, hey, she might not even be ready for the start of the season? Listen, it's all conjecture. Maybe they will. Maybe there's a team that really believes what she put on tape last season is something they can buy into, and they're going to go out there and offer her a contract. Right now, I just don't see it. I know New York wants to bring her back, and that New York values her. They loved her size. They loved her scoring touch. She was, they really felt like they settled into something good with her at the net front on the power play. So, I get the sense that they want to bring her back. I just don't think that they'll need to protect her in Phase 3 to be able to do that. So, I'm right. Those are the. I think the only other 2 forwards that really work their way into this conversation in any meaningful way. I just don't think that you can justify protecting one of them if Paetyn Levis is on the board or over one of the defenders that we were just talking about. So, that's something to watch for. I think that's just, hey, this is expansion, man. Like, you can't keep and you can't save everyone. You're destined to lose talent. Every team is. Even Vancouver eventually is going to lose some players here. The last part of this, when I wrote my article this afternoon, I talked about Nicole Hensley, who was at the time was an unrestricted free agent, and whether or not New York would do one of the maneuvers that's allowed in expansion, which is that you can sign and protect any UFA, not just your own. Go out there and sign anyone. That, would New York target someone like Nicole Hensley? Because I was a little surprised to see that she made it through Phase 2 unsigned. And for a team like New York that just lost its starting goalie in Kayle Osborne and doesn't have a clear starter in the ranks with either Callie Shanahan or Kaylee Doyle, that, it'd be nice to ease some of that anxiety and go out there and just sign, even if it's a stopgap 1-year thing, to go out there and sign a proven starter like Nicole Hensley. That window quickly closed, and I've gone back and I've edited the article, so it's already been changed. But Nicole Hensley signed with Las Vegas this evening. I think that means that you're not going to see, I think safe to say you're not going to see the Sirens protect a goalie in Phase 3 anymore. Because there's just not another option that is frankly is going to be worth it. Again, when we're talking about the talent that they're trying to keep here. Like, there's already a juggle in the defensive core. That you've got 3 protection slots and 4 defenders that you really like. And then you add in the forwards, and you like Paetyn Levis, you'd like to keep her. You'd love to keep Krizova and Taylor Girard. You'd like to keep some of those other bottom sixers as well, but hey, it's a numbers game. That it's the same thing with the goalies that are left in the UFA market. Like, there are a couple that I suppose are interesting. Elaine Chuli is one that played 8 games for Toronto and got some run when Reagan Kirk was out. Sandra Obstrider from Montreal backing up Anne-Renee Desbiens. Her workload might not necessarily be a reflection of her talent. She's backing up Anne-Renee Desbiens. There are a lot of goalies that would back up Anne-Renee Desbiens and not necessarily play a ton. But that's a big risk to take on. Chuli played 8 games last season. Abstrider played 5. That is if you're going to use one of your 3 protection slots on them and sign them in this phase, that's a big swing to take. It's one thing when it's Hensley, who, the stats were not, I don't think they pop off the page in 2025-26, but she's a starting goalie. She's a proven starting goalie. And you can go back to the 2024 playoffs, and she's a huge part of why Minnesota wins. She lights out in that run. That even if it was a 1-year deal, I think you could talk yourself into that and still maybe even pursue a goalie in the draft, pursue your goalie of the future, but say, hey, we don't feel good about going into the draft without a starter. Let's lock this down. But clearly, you had 2 expansion teams that didn't have goalies yet. Now Las Vegas locks up one. I think odds were Hensley was going to go to an expansion team. I didn't think the New York to Hensley connection, as much as I saw fans talk about it, and I think it was worth discussing because it was something that, you wouldn't blame them for going down that road and doing that and using one of the 3 protection slots there. I didn't find it particularly realistic. And now that it's off the table, I think once again it just emphasizes how important this draft will be for New York in terms of finding their goalie of the future, or at least their goalie for next season. Does Las Vegas signing a goalie here help them? Sure, because now there's only one expansion team that needs a starting goalie. And are they going to get it in Phase 3 or Phase 4? And we talked about the other goalies that are available here. On the UFA market, none that really move the needle. Kristen Campbell is still on the board for a team to lock down and say, hey, you're a starter. I do think that's something that could happen. But for New York, I think once again the route is through the draft. Now, I would not cross out any team that already has a goalie from drafting Andrea Branley in the first 2 rounds. And Branley is the consensus top goalie prospect in this draft. Kyle Cushman actually just released, I'll plug him because he does great work. He just released, I think it's like his top 70 or 80 something prospects, his rankings for the 2026 PWHL draft. I won't spoil because it's on Substack, but he has Branley in the top 12, which is different from some of the other draft rankings that have been released so far. You could see a team, even one that already has a goalie, being desperate, especially an expansion team, and taking Branley in the first round. And we still, what's crazy is that the draft is, I'm recording this Wednesday, so on the 10th. The draft's on the 17th, so as I'm recording it, it's a week away. By the time this episode comes out, the draft will be less than a week away. And the draft order is still not confirmed, which is absolutely insane. Part of me has to wonder if the GMs know by now what the draft order is and they just haven't announced it. When you see Detroit willingly sending a first-round pick to Las Vegas as part of that Hillary Knight trade, would they do that deal if there was a chance that pick could be number 2 overall in this draft? You could have a chance to get Edwards or Abby Murphy? Probably not, right? So I wonder if the GMs know. I mean, part of me is how could they not? You're scouting for a draft, and you're supposed to scout everyone, but it really helps to know where you're picking in terms of who you think is going to be on the board. So the fact that the public doesn't know where the draft order is yet, and we don't know if the GMs know what the draft order is yet, it's just absurd to me. But yet, part of the argument for going after Nicole Hensley is that New York can't bank on getting Andrea Branley in the second round with the 15th overall pick. There's a pretty good chance that she's gone by then. The more I watch expansion unfold, the more I see how much emphasis has been put on goaltending, the more I feel that Branley won't be available for New York if they have the 15th overall pick by that time. And then you're tasked with an interesting dilemma of, the next best bet there is Tia Chan from UConn, who is not really supposed to go in the Branley range, but then if you're the Sirens, can you afford to wait till the 3rd round and see if she's still there, that now maybe you have to reach for Tia Chan in the 2nd round? It puts you in a tough spot where that's the big question mark here about New York's offseason is what are they going to be able to do with the goaltending? You get Branley or Chan, I think you feel okay about things. It's not going to be a picture-perfect situation. I don't think you ever feel great about an untested rookie at the pro level going in and they're your full-bore starter. But it certainly feels like that's the route that New York's going to have to take. I think that's basically it here. I'll plug 2 articles. One's already out. It was basically this, but in written form, kind of outlining the different paths that New York can take. If you watch this episode in full, I don't know that you need to check out that article, which is already up, and I'll link it. But if you want to give me page views, I won't complain. The other thing I have coming out that probably won't be out by the time this episode drops, but if you're watching this by Thursday afternoon, it should be up, is I'm going to do a little Siren Sounds column, and it's just going to be snippets from across the league with the expansion teams about some of the former Sirens and some buzz around that stuff. There was some, I tweeted some of the stuff out, so you may have already seen it, but there were some interesting quotes from media availability on Tuesday from former Sirens or coaches that took some of those Sirens in expansion that I think will be interesting, at least as a quick little hitter piece. So that'll be out soon. But yeah, that's it. So Phase 3 wraps up Friday, so we'll know New York's protected list by that afternoon or that evening, basically. And if they sign anyone unrestricted, I don't think really that we're going to see anyone unrestricted end up on New York's protected list here in Phase 3. But it could happen, and if it does, then that's maybe something that we would find out a couple of days in advance. But that's basically it. I imagine we'll be doing another episode next week as we look to start previewing the draft, and Phase 4 will take effect. It's all going by like crazy. But, yep, that's basically it. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Take care.